At Thanksgiving dinner, my sister stood up and announced, "We voted, and you're not family anymore." The sentence didn't come with yelling. It wasn't theatrical. It came gently, like a well-rehearsed line in a play where I was the only one who didn't know the script. Hannah stood up in her tailored ivory dress, glass in hand, smiling as if announcing someone's promotion. Around the table, my father nodded. My mother wiped an invisible tear. Even my ex-husband Andrew, seated beside her like he belonged there more than I ever did, raised his glass. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just looked around the table at the people I'd bought gifts for, covered debts for, helped get jobs and second chances. And I reached slowly for the folder I'd brought with me, the one I never intended to open unless this moment arrived. But let me go back. I'm Nicole Kidman, not the actress, obviously, just a woman with the same name, though mine never appeared in lights. I'm 43, based in San Diego, and I spent the last 20 years building my career as a human resources executive, not the kind that hands out office cupcakes or sends birthday emails. My work has involved high-stakes restructuring, executive investigations, and culture rebuilds for companies on the verge of implosion. I was the person they called when things got too messy for legal to handle. Ironically, no amount of corporate crisis management prepared me for the implosion in my own family. I grew up in a quiet suburb of San Bernardino, where everyone knew our lawn was the greenest, and my mother Carol's lemon pie won the community bake-off 5 years running. My father, Dennis, was a quiet man who believed in rules and rarely broke eye contact. My younger sister Hannah was the golden child. You could smell it before you could name it, when she got a C in algebra. My mother baked her cookies and told her she was too creative for numbers, when I got an A in calculus. They asked why I didn't try out for student council instead. From a young age, I knew how to make myself useful. I fixed things. Conflict between parents, I mediated. Problems with bills, I found ways to cut expenses or pick up a babysitting job. When I got into college on scholarship, I didn't expect applause. I expected silence. And that's what I got. I put myself through graduate school, earned my MBA while working full-time, and by the time I was 30, I had been promoted twice at the firm I helped pull out of a multi-million-dollar harassment scandal. Meanwhile, Hannah bounced through nonprofit internships, blogged about wellness, and eventually married a guy who ran a boutique marketing firm his dad funded. My parents posted about her wedding photos for months. They never asked if I wanted help covering my divorce lawyer fees when my marriage to Andrew unraveled. Andrew and I had met at a networking event in downtown San Diego. He was charming, smart, spoke 5 languages, and seemed to understand that my ambition wasn't something to compete with, but grow alongside. That illusion lasted almost 4 years, in the end. He said I had become too strategic. He said it like it was an insult. I suppose it was. To him, when he left, I barely cried, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I'd learned early on that tears in my family were a form of currency, and mine were worth less. I rebuilt again, promoted to KHRO at my firm, launched an initiative to support displaced employees during a wave of tech layoffs, quietly donated to Hannah's community center project, even though she never thanked me directly. My mother just said, "Hannah told us someone generous stepped in. Isn't that wonderful?" Then came the moment I regret most. I recommended Hannah for a mid-level management role in our partner organization. She had no real qualifications, but I thought maybe this would be a bridge, a way to share something, reconnect. I coached her through the interview, gave her my resume template, even vouched for her work ethic. 3 months later, she was promoted above one of my best internal candidates. 6 months after that, she was speaking on panels about workplace wellness and female leadership dynamics, using anecdotes I had shared privately as her own. At first, I said nothing. Then I saw her LinkedIn post, quoting a phrase I had once written in a leadership memo, word for word. No attribution. But the final cut wasn't professional. It was personal, at a company off-site. I noticed Andrew, my ex-husband. He was there as a guest speaker. I didn't recognize him at first. Then I saw him laughing with Hannah at the open bar, her hand on his arm, his body leaning in like a tree drawn toward sunlight. My stomach tightened. That night, I went home early. I didn't mention it to anyone. Weeks passed. Then came a formal complaint from one of our partners, suggesting conflicts of interest and accusations that I was favoring certain candidates. I knew who had planted the seeds, quietly, subtly. Emails were misinterpreted, meeting notes edited. I was called in for an internal audit by the CEO, Jordan Ellis. His tone was respectful. His eyes were skeptical. I wasn't fired. I was asked to step aside for the good of company optics, a gentle way of saying, disappear gracefully, or we'll help you do it. So I disappeared. Gracefully. But I took copies of everything, emails, memos, performance reviews, and a list of every project I'd led or salvaged. I also started seeing a legal consultant, just in case. My family didn't ask why I left the company. They asked if I was taking time to focus on myself when I didn't show up for Hannah's 35th birthday brunch. My mother sent me a long text ending with, "Don't let bitterness isolate you from the people who love you most." When the Thanksgiving invitation came, it looked ordinary, the same template my mother used every year. Menu attached, RSVP by November 20th. I almost deleted it, but something stopped me. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I was just curious. Either way, I said yes. And that's how I ended up at the long mahogany table, between the people I once thought were my foundation, watching my sister stand, her voice clear and sweet as she said, "We voted, and you're not family anymore." I didn't flinch. I just reached into my bag, and I said, calmly, "Then I suppose you won't be needing this." The folder I brought to Thanksgiving wasn't an impulsive move. It was the result of years of knowing things without saying them, of watching betrayal evolve in slow, polite increments, like water climbing the sides of a glass just before it spills. I didn't open it immediately because I didn't need to. Not yet. I wanted to see how far they would go, how convincingly they could play this final act. But as Hannah sat back down after announcing that I was no longer part of the family, and as glasses were lifted like the verdict of a jury, I realized this performance had been rehearsed for far longer than I'd admitted to myself. What I didn't say that night, and what none of them knew, was that I'd been paying attention for over 2 years. The signs weren't obvious at first. I thought they were small slips, like when Hannah repeated a phrase I had used in a leadership meeting and claimed it as her own, or when she volunteered to take over a staff mentoring program I'd created and suddenly started pitching it as part of her innovation strategy. At first, I dismissed it. She's my sister. I thought, maybe we're just aligned in how we think. Maybe this is how support looks when you're trying to grow someone. But deep down, I already knew I was being replicated, not out of admiration, but as a stepping stone. Hannah had a gift, but it wasn't leadership or strategy or even communication. Her real talent was proximity. She knew how to get close to things that were working and reframe them just enough to make people believe she had originated them. She didn't steal credit openly. She absorbed it. She used familiarity as camouflage, and I, like everyone else, let it happen for far too long. The turning point came during our company's executive realignment. I was asked to create performance assessments for several mid-tier leaders and present a new development framework for department heads. I worked late nights for 2 weeks, crafting custom evaluations that reflected the nuances of each team structure. When I submitted them to Jordan Ellis, our CEO, he nodded with quiet approval, but asked Hannah to walk him through the broader leadership lens. Without missing a beat, she stepped in, outlined the structure I had built, and dropped a line I'd used in my draft report, word for word. It's about creating leaders who feel safe enough to admit what they don't know. Jordan smiled. I sat in silence. That silence became a pattern. When she launched her internal equity task force, an initiative lifted directly from a workshop I had led, she called it her personal mission. When she presented a burnout recovery model based on anonymous exit interviews I had conducted the year prior, she added her name to the footer and distributed it to senior stakeholders. Each time, I swallowed the discomfort and reminded myself that maybe the goal was the work itself, not the recognition. Maybe letting her shine meant being a good sister, a good professional, someone who didn't make everything about ego. But ego had nothing to do with it. It was integrity. And that line was being crossed over and over in ways I could no longer ignore. Then came Andrew. I hadn't seen him since our divorce. And I certainly hadn't expected to see him sitting beside Hannah at a partner retreat, smiling like nothing had ever gone wrong between us. When I asked Jordan who invited him, he said Hannah had suggested bringing in external advisors to freshen up our executive lens. Andrew's name was first on the list. I kept my face still. I nodded. I excused myself early. That night, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop. I began pulling together records, email drafts, original timestamped documents, Slack threads that showed idea generation, revisions, internal feedback. I compared them to the materials Hannah had presented externally. There was no coincidence. She had lifted entire frameworks, edited the formatting, and branded them as her own. But more than that, she had altered the timeline, making it appear as though her versions had preceded mine. It was deliberate, and it was dangerous. I began meeting discreetly with a legal advisor who specialized in intellectual property within corporate environments. He confirmed my instincts. While not criminal, the pattern bordered on actionable misrepresentation. But he also asked a more difficult question. What do you want out of this revenge or resolution? I didn't answer right away. At that point, I didn't know. Part of me still believed maybe she didn't understand the damage she was causing. Maybe she was insecure, or lost, or trying to find a way to matter. But that narrative collapsed a month later when I was called into an internal review. A senior stakeholder had raised concerns about a hiring pattern that allegedly favored candidates connected to my previous consulting network. The audit found nothing unethical, but the implication had already landed. My judgment was now in question. I knew exactly where the rumor had started. When I confronted Jordan, he looked at me with something close to regret. Nicole, this may be a good time for a break. You've earned it. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation to disappear. And so I did. I submitted my resignation under the guise of needing personal space, signed a non-disparagement clause, and walked away from a company I had helped shape from the inside out. My parents didn't ask for details. My mother sent me a care package with a card that read, "Sometimes letting go is strength." My father said, "Hannah's really thriving lately. She's found her rhythm." I spent the next 3 months watching from a distance. Hannah's new team started to fracture. Project deadlines slipped. Staff turnover increased. I received a message from one of my former direct reports, asking if I had time for a confidential call. She's pushing things she doesn't understand. They said, She's using your old frameworks, but the context isn't there. It's not working. Still, I said nothing, not to the company, not to my family, not to her. I let the silence stretch, but I kept documenting everything, not to punish her, to protect myself. That Thanksgiving invitation came at just the right time, too timed, too rehearsed, my mother said. It would mean a lot to your sister if you came, my father added. She's got some exciting news to share. I didn't expect honesty, but I didn't expect exile either. When Hannah stood up and made that toast, something in me clicked. They were doing it again, turning me into the villain in a narrative I never asked to be in. But this time, I was ready. I didn't need their apology. I didn't want their validation. I just needed them to see the truth before I walked away for good. So when I reached for the folder and said, "Then I suppose you won't be needing this," I wasn't bluffing. I was finally showing them who I had always been. The folder sat beside me through dinner like a loaded question no one dared to ask. No one reached for it. No one even looked at it directly. But I could feel its presence change the air. The smug confidence that had filled the room after Hannah's announcement began to thin, just slightly. I said nothing else. I wanted the silence to do the work. It was the kind of silence that made people wonder whether they had gone too far, the kind that made them start to rewind their words in their heads, scanning for mistakes. I watched as my mother shifted in her seat, adjusting her bracelet over and over. My father poured himself more wine. Andrew leaned toward Hannah and whispered something that made her frown, but she didn't take it back. None of them did. So I kept quiet and let the unease grow roots. After dessert was cleared and small talk failed to fill the cracks, I stood up, took my folder, and said I needed to head home early. I thanked them for dinner. I didn't raise my voice, didn't drop the bomb they feared I might. The control unsettled them more than confrontation would have. The next day, I drove to Rebecca's office, a modest corner unit tucked above a bookstore downtown. She had been my sounding board for the past year, not just professionally, but personally. She was one of the few people who knew the full story and never once told me to get over it or be the bigger person. She read people well, especially when they were lying to themselves. When I told her what happened at Thanksgiving, she didn't look shocked. She just said, "Then it's time." She opened her laptop and pulled up the files we had quietly compiled over the past year and a half. Every document had been scanned, backed up, and annotated. Emails forwarded from my account, showing the original timestamps, side-by-side comparisons of Hannah's presentations with my earlier frameworks, legal memos outlining the limits of our company's non-disparagement clauses and the protections I still had. This wasn't a revenge mission. It was a safety net, because when someone rewrites your work, your reputation, and eventually your place in the family, you need something that doesn't shift with public opinion or personal charm. You need receipts. We went through each folder carefully, not because I doubted what was in them, but because I wanted to feel the weight of the truth I had carried alone. I remembered writing those memos at midnight after crisis meetings, staying late to clean up leadership messes while Hannah posted filtered selfies from yoga retreats. I remembered the workshops I built from scratch, only to see them repackaged and presented as her visionary model. I remembered the offhand comments from executives who started referring to her as a natural leader while telling me I had too much structure in my approach. The narrative had shifted, and I had let it, trying not to seem territorial, trying not to make waves. But truth doesn't stay buried. It waits, and when it resurfaces, it brings more than clarity. It brings consequences. That night, I went home and sat in the quiet of my living room, looking at the stack of documentation Rebecca had printed for legal review. It wasn't just proof, it was memory. Each file was a version of myself I had edited down for the comfort of others. I had become so used to being the stable one, the one who didn't need attention, that I hadn't noticed how easily I had become invisible. My therapist once told me that people raised to be useful often struggle to be seen. They're taught that value comes from service, not presence. That was me, useful daughter, reliable executive, silent witness. But usefulness can become a trap when it's never balanced with being valued. I thought about all the times my parents asked me to cover Hannah's tuition gaps, or help with their mortgage during my dad's illness, or step in when Hannah's first business idea collapsed. I always said yes, not because I was a martyr, but because I didn't know how to say no without feeling like I was abandoning them. Boundaries had never been part of our family language, only sacrifice. That night, I wrote down 3 questions on a notepad. What do I want to protect? What am I no longer willing to tolerate? And what does accountability look like if I don't need apology to heal the next morning? I met with Thomas Ruiz, a corporate law advisor who had handled several high-profile internal fraud cases. He was calm, meticulous, and had a particular interest in cases involving family dynamics inside business. He didn't flinch when I laid out my situation. He just listened. Then he asked, "Do you want to go public, or do you want leverage?" I told him I wanted truth without spectacle. I wanted clarity, not revenge. I wanted something that couldn't be manipulated or spun into a sob story by my sister or neutralized by my parents' polished suburban image. I wanted them to see what they had done and feel the discomfort of not being able to explain it away. Over the next week, Thomas and Rebecca worked together to assemble a formal report clean, chronological, and impossible to dismiss. It didn't accuse, it documented. It didn't speculate, it cited evidence. And in the final pages was a settlement option, a structured agreement offering non-disclosure and waiver of litigation in exchange for written acknowledgement and internal accountability. It wasn't a threat. It was an offer. One that said, "We both know what happened. Here's a way forward without destroying what little dignity you have left." I didn't send it. Not yet. I wanted to see if any of them would reach out after Thanksgiving. If anyone would break the silence with something resembling remorse, a message, a question, even a badly worded attempt at reconciliation. Nothing came. Not from my parents. Not from Hannah. Not from Andrew. It was as if they believed that cutting me out had finalized the story, that their toast had sealed the ending, but they had misunderstood the nature of quiet people. We don't disappear. We observe. We record. And eventually, we choose the moment to speak, carefully, powerfully, and with all the facts in hand. That was the gift they gave me by trying to erase me. They made me undeniable, and soon. I would remind them what truth sounds like when it's no longer afraid of being inconvenient. It started small. The shift, subtle, quiet, almost undetectable if you didn't know what to look for. But I had spent a lifetime reading silences, knowing when something had cracked, even if no one said a word. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I got a message from one of my old colleagues at the firm. No subject line, just thought you'd want to see this. Attached was a forwarded internal memo, anonymous feedback from team leads expressing concern over recent leadership changes and a noticeable dip in morale following the implementation of new project frameworks. I didn't smile, but I did lean back in my chair and reread the memo twice. There it was, not my revenge, just their own reckoning. Arriving on schedule, I hadn't done anything. I hadn't released a single document, but the truth, once unmoored, always finds its way to the surface. The irony was hard to miss. The very structures Hannah had hijacked and repackaged were starting to collapse without the understanding that built them. A framework is not just a template. It's a translation of culture, human rhythm, organizational trust. You can't fake it for long. And when it's stolen, the edges fray first. Over the following month, a quiet unraveling began. Hannah's alignment model was quietly shelved. A DEI partnership she'd spearheaded went unrenewed. I heard from Rebecca that Jordan had started assigning sensitive team reviews to a new interim consultant brought in from outside. Hannah's name had stopped appearing on leadership announcements. Still, I said nothing. I didn't post anything. I didn't share any files. I just watched the silence tighten around them. And I waited, because timing matters. Just like they had waited for Thanksgiving to stage their grand rewrite of family history. I was waiting for the moment when denial could no longer protect them. That moment came faster than I expected. In early February, I got another message, this time from a junior analyst who had once interned under me. She said she'd been assigned to one of Hannah's performance strategy teams and was confused because the structure didn't seem to match any of the original documentation they had trained on. "Did you design the original materials?" she asked. "Because we're being told to ignore the old versions." But none of this makes sense. I responded with a simple sentence. "Thank you for reaching out. Trust your instincts." I didn't need to clarify anything else. I knew that feeling when something looks right on paper but feels wrong in motion. That gap is where reputations start to crack. A week later, Rebecca called me. She sounded different, more alert. "It's coming apart." She said, "They know something's off. Jordan's been reaching out to external consultants for feedback audits. He's nervous. He just won't admit it yet." And Hannah, I asked, still pretending everything's fine, posting motivational quotes on LinkedIn, talking about resilience and vision. But internally, she's lost 3 direct reports in a month. One of them cited toxic micromanagement in their exit interview. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "Good." Rebecca paused. "Nicole, I know you're watching this carefully, and I don't blame you. But how far do you want to go with this?" It was the right question, one I had been circling for months. I already had the legal files. I had the internal audit data. I had clear documentation that Hannah had misrepresented her role in the creation of critical policy structures. But I also knew this wasn't just about my reputation. It was about recognizing where justice ends and peace begins. And I wasn't sure yet which one I was ready for. I told her I needed more time. What I didn't say was that a part of me still wanted to believe that maybe they would reach out, that someone, anyone, would come forward and say, "We got it wrong." But no one did. Not even Vanessa, my cousin, who had quietly averted her eyes during the Thanksgiving toast. She sent me a holiday card that said, "Thinking of you," and nothing else. It felt like a whisper in a hurricane. I put it away in a drawer, and still, the unraveling continued. I started hearing my name again. Indirectly, one of my former executive peers asked if I'd be open to doing a private workshop on crisis culture repair. Another said he'd used my original performance rubric to restructure his own division and called it the most human-centered tool he'd ever used. They didn't know about the documents. They didn't know what I was holding. They just remembered the work. That was when I realized I didn't need to fight to reclaim anything. My work had never needed to scream. It had always spoken for itself. It was Hannah who had needed volume, who had relied on optics and borrowed brilliance, and when that brilliance was no longer within reach, the shine faded. She had built a brand out of my voice, and now, without it, the silence was deafening. In mid-March, I got one more message, this time from Andrew. No subject line again, just one sentence. If you're still collecting receipts, you might want to check the expense reports from Q3 last year. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The message itself confirmed everything, not just about what they had done, but about the kind of people they had become to each other. I imagined the blame starting to circle, the justifications, the finger-pointing, the slow decay of alliances built on mutual advantage instead of trust. I pictured the same dinner table from Thanksgiving, but now each person sitting slightly farther apart, watching their words, measuring their glances, no more toasts, no more performances, just the weight of a truth they could no longer coordinate around. And me, I had already begun writing something new, quietly advising a rising nonprofit with an actual vision, building frameworks, again, not to prove anything, but because it felt good to create without being watched, measured, or mimicked. I wasn't chasing redemption. I was rebuilding oxygen. I still hadn't shared the folder, but I knew the time was close, not to destroy, to close the loop, because sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply becoming someone they can no longer reach. The thing about truth is, it doesn't go away when you ignore it. It waits, quietly, patiently, like a lit fuse that doesn't spark until you're too close to step back. And by the time March turned into April, I knew I was done waiting. I didn't need an apology anymore. I didn't need a confrontation either. What I needed was clarity, the kind that leaves no space for gaslighting, for doubt, or for revision. So I called Thomas and said it was time. He didn't ask for confirmation. He already knew, over the next week. We prepared a formal delivery of the documentation. It wasn't public. It wasn't performative. We sent the file directly to Jordan Ellis with a brief letter outlining the full timeline of intellectual misrepresentation, the false attribution of leadership frameworks, and the potential liability exposure tied to the use of altered documentation in funding proposals. We didn't accuse, we documented. We offered mediation if they wished to resolve the matter internally, but included language making it clear we were prepared to escalate if necessary. It was clean, legal, precise. I didn't send it to Hannah, not out of mercy, but because she wasn't the one holding the last card anymore. That seat now belonged to the institution she had manipulated. The response came fast, faster than I expected, within 4 days. Jordan replied through counsel, requesting a private conversation. I agreed on the condition that it be recorded and transcribed. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. I arrived early, coffee in hand, hair pulled back, wearing the exact same navy blazer I had worn during my first major crisis mediation 10 years earlier. It wasn't sentimental. It was armor. Jordan greeted me with polite restraint. He looked older, not in the way that time does, but in the way responsibility does when it finally catches up. He didn't deny anything. He didn't defend Hannah either. He simply said, "We failed to verify, and we acted on assumptions." I nodded. I wasn't there to make him grovel. I was there to give him no room to rewrite the narrative. The rest of the meeting was procedural. They agreed to issue an internal memo correcting attribution of the original strategic materials, offer a confidential written acknowledgement of the IP breach, and provide a sealed letter confirming no wrongdoing on my part during my final review cycle. In return, I would agree not to pursue further legal action or release the documentation publicly. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. More than enough, because it rewrote the record where it mattered. And just like that, I had my name back, quietly, without press, without drama, just fact. I left the building with the transcript and letter in hand, and for the first time in over 2 years, I felt my shoulders drop, not in defeat, but in release. When I got home, I placed the folder in a drawer and locked it, not because I was afraid it might be taken, but because I no longer needed to carry it everywhere like a shield. That night, I slept 8 uninterrupted hours, no dreams, no tension in my jaw, just silence. The next day, I sent an email to Rebecca, no subject, no body, just the PDF attachment with the finalized acknowledgement letter. 10 minutes later, she replied with one line, "It's over, and it's yours again." I didn't respond. I just sat at my kitchen table and let that sentence sink in. It wasn't about winning. It was about being seen again as the person I had always been before their narrative tried to replace me. A few days later, I ran into Vanessa at a bookstore downtown. We hadn't spoken since Thanksgiving. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "Hey," she said, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't expect to see you here. I live here." I replied evenly. "Where did you expect I'd gone?" She gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I guess I wasn't sure." I waited, let her sit in the discomfort. She finally added, "I didn't know they were going to do that. Nicole, the vote thing, the whole performance. I thought it was just going to be a talk, some kind of intervention, maybe not exile, but you stayed." I said, "You didn't speak up." I froze. She admitted, "I regret it. I should have said something. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, but I appreciated the attempt." I nodded and turned to leave, but she stopped me. "Are you all right now?" I looked her in the eye and said, "I've never been clearer, and I meant it, because something had shifted. Not in the world, but in me. I had stopped expecting other people to restore what they broke. I had done it myself. And once you've rebuilt without their tools, you realize how unnecessary their approval ever was. That weekend, I hosted a quiet dinner at my home, just 6 people. Rebecca, a few colleagues from my new advisory role, and Sophia, my oldest friend, who had seen every version of me and never once tried to rewrite any of them. I made a roast chicken, poured good wine, and used my grandmother's dishes, the ones my mother insisted no one wanted anymore. We laughed, talked about life, about choices, about freedom. There was no toast, no announcements, no votes, just real people, showing up without performance. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't lost a family. I had shed a script, and what remained wasn't a tragedy. It was truth, quiet, uncompromised, mine. A week after the acknowledgement letter was signed, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her tone was lighter than I expected, measured, practiced, like someone who wanted to sound casual but had rehearsed the words in front of a mirror. "Hi, Nicole," she said. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. We haven't heard from you in a while. Your father and I were talking, and we were thinking, maybe it's time to start fresh. Hannah's going through a tough time right now, lots of pressure at work. Maybe we could do dinner sometime, just the family, no drama. Let me know." She ended the message without a goodbye, just silence, as if leaving the last note open might make it sound less forced. I listened to the message 3 times, not because I was unsure how to respond, but because I wanted to hear what wasn't being said. Not once did she reference Thanksgiving. Not once did she mention the vote, the exile, the very public decision to cut me out in front of people who once called me daughter, sister, family. There was no apology, just a gentle request to forget. to pretend it never happened, to reset the script as if the scene had played out on a stage that could be cleared with a new act. But this wasn't a stage, and I wasn't a character anymore. I didn't respond, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. I had nothing left to explain, no more roles to play in their carefully curated story of selective love. They had written me out, and I had taken the cue, just not the way they'd expected. I didn't retreat. I rewrote the ending. In the following months, I poured everything into building a new chapter. The nonprofit, where I'd been quietly consulting, brought me on full-time as a strategic lead. It wasn't a glamorous title, and I didn't want one. It gave me space to build real systems again, structures that didn't require defending or disguising. I trained a young team of diverse voices, people who weren't trying to impress, but to impact. And for the first time in years, I felt excited on Monday mornings. I reclaimed my energy, my time, my voice. I reconnected with a few old friends who had drifted not out of malice, but because I'd stopped reaching back. I realized how often I'd been unavailable emotionally, not because I didn't care, but because I was always in survival mode. Always bracing, always calculating how to stay ahead of whatever twist was coming next. Now, there was space for conversation, for laughter, for stillness. I changed my phone number, kept the voicemail from my mother saved, not out of spite, but as a reminder of what I would no longer accept as love. I donated half of the clothes I had once bought to look presentable for family gatherings where I was never truly seen. I changed nothing about my appearance except the way I carried myself, and that changed everything. Word trickled in slowly, through mutuals and shared contacts. Hannah had stepped back from several initiatives. A few of her public speaking events were postponed. There were quiet rumors about internal restructuring. Andrew had taken a position in another city. My parents had stopped posting photos. The curated image had cracked. I felt nothing triumphant, only still. I hadn't caused it. I hadn't celebrated it. I had simply outlasted it. One afternoon, I found myself walking through a local market and ran into an old colleague, Maya, a program manager I had once mentored in my early 30s. She paused, looked at me, and said, "I barely recognized you. You look light." I smiled. "That's because I am." We grabbed coffee and talked for over an hour. She told me how much the performance framework I'd designed had shaped her leadership approach. She still used my original model with her team. It's still the only system I've found that doesn't treat people like productivity machines. She said, "It made me a better manager, a better person." Honestly, I didn't need to be thanked, but hearing it reminded me why I ever started in this work to begin with. Not for credit, but for meaning. And meaning, unlike recognition, can't be stolen. It's built, layer by layer, in every unseen decision to do something right when it would have been easier to go silent. When I got home that evening, I made myself dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat by the window. The light outside was shifting spring, folding slowly into early summer. I thought of the Thanksgiving table, the way they had all raised their glasses like a final act, not realizing the curtain hadn't closed. I thought of the girl I had been hungry for approval, so used to earning love through utility that I didn't notice when it became currency. I thought of how far I had come, not in distance, but in depth. And then I thought of something Dr. Harper once told me in therapy. There's a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It just lets you walk into rooms without shrinking. That was me now, whole, not because they made it right, but because I stopped waiting for them to. Not every story needs to end with confrontation. Some stories end with quiet exits, and locked folders. And some victories don't come with applause. They come when you finally recognize your own worth, without waiting for someone else to name it for you. It had been 5 months since the Thanksgiving that changed everything. And I had thought, naively perhaps, that I wouldn't cross paths with any of them again, anytime soon. But then came the email from the board at the Regional Leadership Summit. They were hosting their annual panel on resilient leadership through transition, and I had been recommended as a closing speaker. I almost laughed when I saw who was moderating the morning session. Hannah, the very same Hannah who once said I was too emotionally structured to inspire innovation. Now curating a panel about resilience, the irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't say no. I didn't even hesitate. I accepted the invitation and sent over my revised keynote titled, "The Power of Being Erased and Rewriting Yourself." Anyway, I knew exactly what I was doing, not out of spite, but out of certainty. There are moments when the universe invites you not to retaliate, but to stand still and let contrast do the speaking. The day of the summit arrived on a clear Friday morning. I dressed simply, no power suit, no statement heels, just a clean black dress and a calm face. When I arrived at the venue, I saw her almost immediately. Hannah stood by the registration table, laughing lightly with a junior coordinator. Her badge turned slightly so her name barely showed. When our eyes met, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not guilt, just recognition, the look you give someone you can no longer predict. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I walked past her and checked in. 30 minutes later, I sat quietly at the back of the room as she opened her panel with phrases that sounded recycled and empty. Resilience is about staying centered even when the narrative shifts. I almost smiled because I knew where she had learned that sentence, from me, from an internal workshop 3 years ago that she had once claimed was too soft to scale. Now she was quoting it, badly. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't mention her. I didn't mention the company. I didn't even mention the betrayal. Instead, I talked about silence, about how being sidelined teaches you how to listen differently, about how resilience isn't loud. It's measured. It's the ability to build again without asking for permission. I talked about the difference between being celebrated and being respected. One fades, the other sustains. I ended with a line I had written the night before, one that came not from anger, but from clarity. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who doesn't need the mic to prove they belong. The applause was quiet at first, then steady, then lasting. I stepped off the stage, feeling nothing dramatic, just grounded. I didn't look for Hannah. I didn't need to. That afternoon, I received a message from an attendee who had been part of my original mentorship program years ago. She wrote, "I didn't know the full story, but something about the way you stood there today that was healing. Thank you for not disappearing." That line stayed with me, not disappearing, because that's what people like Hannah count on, that you'll fade, that your silence equals defeat. But some silences are just waiting for the right moment to speak. Over the next few weeks, more invitations came in, thought pieces, round tables, consultations, not because I marketed myself, but because people remembered, not the drama, the impact, the systems I built, the values I held, the way I made spaces feel like they belonged to more than just the loudest person in the room. One day, I received a letter, yes, a printed letter from my father. It was handwritten, short, almost reluctant. "I saw a clip of your talk. Your mother and I, we didn't realize what you were going through. We thought you were strong. We thought you didn't need anything. Maybe we were wrong." There was no mention of the vote, no mention of Hannah, No apology, just that line. Maybe we were wrong. It wasn't closure. It wasn't healing, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that's enough. I didn't write back. I wasn't angry. I was just done needing their version of love to feel whole. Because the people who matter now, the ones who see me clearly, don't ask me to shrink. Don't ask me to translate myself into something easier to digest. They meet me where I am, fully. I kept the letter, folded it neatly, placed it in the same drawer where the acknowledgement letter from the company lived. Not trophies, not scars, just evidence that I had survived something quietly brutal and come out intact, more than intact, transformed. That week, I taught a seminar on ethical leadership at a nearby university. One of the students, a young woman in the back row, asked me during Q&A, "How do you rebuild when the people who hurt you never admit what they did?" I paused, then said, "You stop waiting for them to admit it, and you start living like you never needed them to in the first place." She nodded, eyes glassy, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't just telling my story. I was giving language to others who had been erased in quiet ways, not by enemies, but by people they loved. And what better revenge than that, not to rise above, but to rise through, to be visible again. Not because you forced the world to see you, but because you stopped hiding from yourself. 2 months later, I received an invitation, not an email, a formal, embossed envelope with a gold seal. It was for a charity gala hosted by the Regional Business Association, honoring contributions to organizational ethics and leadership development. I was listed as a finalist. I blinked. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, but no, there it was, my name, printed with care, with a paragraph describing my recent work with nonprofit infrastructure reform and mentorship training programs. I hadn't campaigned for this, hadn't submitted a portfolio. Someone had nominated me, silently, thoughtfully, and the committee had seen enough to shortlist me. I accepted the invitation, not out of vanity, but because I knew who else would be in the room. I didn't go to make a statement. I went to exist, fully, visibly, without apology. That was the statement. The gala was held at a glass-walled venue overlooking the city skyline. Warm lights, polished floors, the sound of clinking glasses and half-laughed conversations. I walked in alone, not isolated, just whole. I recognized a few faces from the old days industry executives, consultants, even former clients who once whispered praise in hallways but never quite defended me when my credit was stripped. Now they looked surprised, not guilty, just unsure how to approach someone they had once misread. I didn't offer them comfort. I didn't glare either. I just stood, present, as myself. Later that evening, they announced the Ethics Award. They listed the nominees one by one, and when my name was called, a quiet pause followed, not awkward, just real, like everyone was processing how it felt to see a name return after being erased. I didn't win the award, and I didn't need to. The applause I received was louder than the winners, not out of sympathy, but recognition. And recognition is a currency no vote can take from you. After the event, I stepped out onto the terrace, needing a moment of air. That's when I saw Hannah. She stood at the far corner, alone, her drink untouched, when she saw me. She stiffened but didn't turn away. I approached slowly, giving her the chance to leave. She didn't. I stopped a few feet away and said, "Evening." She nodded, her voice thin. "You looked centered up there." "I am," I replied. No bravado, no venom, just truth. She looked down at her glass, then said, "They keep talking about your systems, your programs. They've become foundational in some spaces now. I waited, let her sit in the discomfort. That used to be me, she added quietly. I raised an eyebrow. Did it? She didn't respond. There was nothing else to say. No apology, no explanation, just the brittle sound of regret stretching between us. And I let it stay there, because not every silence needs to be filled. I turned to leave, and as I walked away, she called out, "Nicole." I stopped but didn't turn back. I used to think the loudest person in the room was the strongest. She said, "I don't think that anymore." I nodded once and kept walking, not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I didn't need to carry her realization for her. That belonged to her now. I got in my car, took off my shoes, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, not because of her, because I had seen the full circle, not the revenge, the reckoning. And it didn't need to be sharp. It just needed to be final. In the weeks that followed, I received more messages, some congratulatory, some quietly apologetic, old colleagues saying they wished they'd spoken up, a few mentors saying they had underestimated what I carried behind the calm. I responded to some, not all, forgiveness. I had learned, doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it's just the decision to stop letting their weight slow you down. I no longer needed a spotlight. I had found something stronger. Legacy, quiet, steady, undeniable. One morning, I walked past a bookstore display downtown and saw a new leadership book titled Frameworks for Human Resilience. I picked it up, flipped through the pages, and there it was, an entire chapter built on my original model, cited correctly, credited clearly. The author was a former trainee from a workshop I had led 6 years ago. He hadn't asked permission, but he had remembered, and he had honored it. That, I realized, is the mark of true impact. Not how many followers you have, but how many people carry your work forward with integrity. I bought the book, not for myself, but for a young intern I had just started mentoring. Her name was Alina, 23, fierce, curious, a little too quick to apologize for taking up space. I handed it to her at the end of a meeting. "You'll outgrow this book in 5 years," I said, "but keep it anyway, so you'll remember where you started." She smiled, the kind that reaches the eyes. And I knew in that moment that this quiet handing off, this generational restoration was the real full circle moment. Because some stories don't end with thunder. They end with legacy, with soft power, with women who once had to fight for their names, now giving others space to never doubt theirs. 6 months passed, not rushed, just quietly forward. The kind of time you don't measure in milestones, but in how deeply you begin to exhale without even noticing. My life didn't look extraordinary to the outside eye. I still lived in the same modest home. I still took the same route to work, brewed my morning coffee the same way, folded my sweaters the same way I always had. But the woman doing those things had changed, not in her ambition, in her peace. I had stopped needing to constantly prove I belonged in rooms that were designed to keep me on edge. I had started building my own rooms instead, ones with soft lighting, clear lines, no corner where someone could hide malice and charm. My team at the nonprofit had grown. What started as a 2-person initiative to audit ethical gaps in community development had become a state-level pilot program. We were onboarding cities now, real impact. And every time someone asked me how we were growing so fast, I gave the same answer because we listened when no one else did. In late October, I was asked to deliver a guest lecture at the university where I once studied. They wanted me to speak to graduating students about leadership, not just in business, but in life. I hesitated at first. That campus held memories. I had walked those halls when I was still shaping my voice, still shrinking to fit the expectations of others. But I said yes, because if there's anything I've learned, it's that we don't heal by avoiding where we were hurt. We heal by standing there again, taller. The lecture hall was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just no longer dwarfed by it. I stepped onto the stage and took a slow breath. The faces staring back at me were curious, open, nervous like I had been. Leadership, I began, is not about knowing all the answers. It's about staying rooted when someone tries to rewrite your worth. I didn't give them theories. I gave them truth. I told them how easy it is to be seduced by validation, to think that applause equals respect, and how quickly it all disappears when your value becomes inconvenient to someone else's spotlight. The people who erased me, I said, did it in a room full of family, with smiles on their faces, with logic in their voices. And for a while, I thought their version of me was the truth, until I built a new mirror after the talk. One of the students approached me, a young man in a worn sweater and tired eyes. He didn't speak right away. Then he said, "My older brother told me I wasn't main character material, that I should just stay in the background where I belonged. But hearing you today, I think he's wrong." I smiled, not because I was proud, because I knew that line. I had once believed it too. I told him, "You don't have to fight for the spotlight. Just stop dimming your light to protect people who are afraid of it." He nodded, like something had clicked, and that was enough. I walked back to my car, wind picking up around me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving my past, I was shaping someone else's future. A week later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was from last year's Thanksgiving, the moment they raised their glasses. Me, just barely in frame, off to the side, almost cropped out. On the back, written in careful penmanship, were 4 words: "I'm sorry we voted." No signature, no explanation. I knew the handwriting. Vanessa. It didn't undo anything, but I didn't tear it up either. I placed it in the drawer, not with the other letters, just alone, like a closed chapter. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to open. That Sunday, I hosted dinner at my house again. Not a holiday, just dinner. My table was smaller now, but full. People I trusted. People who showed up not because I could offer them something, but because we belonged to each other in the truest way. No expectations, no performances, just presence. We talked about art, about cities, about the quiet thrill of doing work that no one claps for but still matters. Someone asked me, "Do you miss them? Your family?" I paused, thought about it, then answered, "I miss who I hoped they'd become." And that was the truth. I didn't miss the roles, the scripts. I missed the fantasy, the version of family that I held on to for too long, thinking that if I worked hard enough, bent gently enough, they'd finally see me, but they didn't. And when they didn't, I learned to see myself, and that more than justice, more than reputation is what saved me. Not being right, being whole. So when people ask me now what happened that night, when my sister stood up at the Thanksgiving table and said, "We voted, and you're not family anymore," I just smile, not bitterly, not proudly, just knowingly, because they thought they were cutting me off. But really, they set me free. The next Thanksgiving came and went without ceremony. I didn't mark it on the calendar, didn't brace myself, didn't mourn it either. That day, I went for a morning walk along the lake, let the wind brush across my face, and stopped for coffee at a small shop where no one knew my name or cared about my past. It felt good to be ordinary, to simply exist. Around noon, I received a message from Rebecca, Just 2 words. Thinking of you, I replied. Same. No backstory needed. She knew what this day once meant to me, what it had taken to unlearn the reflex of expecting belonging from people who only saw me when I made their lives easier. I spent the evening at Sophia's house, surrounded by her kids and laughter that didn't come with subtext at one point. Her youngest, 5 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs, looked at me and said, "You're my favorite grown-up who listens." And somehow, that meant more than any title I'd ever held. Because for once, I wasn't being admired for how much I endured. I was being valued for simply being present. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a winter retreat for executive women. The theme was rebuilding from quiet collapse. I told my story, not with dramatic flair, but with clarity. No character assassination, no self-pity, just what happened, how I responded, and what it taught me. After the talk, one of the women approached me, older than me, sharp eyes softened by something unspoken. She said, "They didn't see your value because it made them question theirs." I nodded, not because I needed the validation, but because she had named something I had never quite found the words for. That sometimes. People don't erase you out of hate. They erase you because your integrity is a mirror they can't look into for long. That evening, I sat by the fireplace at the retreat cabin, watching the snow fall in slow, lazy flakes. I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence. Not everything broken needs fixing. Some things need leaving. I closed the journal and felt, maybe for the first time in years, complete, not because everything made sense, but because I had stopped needing it to. I didn't need a better version of my mother. I didn't need Hannah to unravel with guilt. I didn't need the world to say, "You were right." I already knew I was. Not in ego, in quiet, daily truth, in the way my work stood on its own, in the way people now came to me not for what I used to be, but for what I had become. And what I had become wasn't a survivor. It wasn't a comeback story. It was a builder, a restorer, a reminder that not all damage is visible and not all healing is loud. A month later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. When I checked it, the voice was hesitant. "Hi, Nicole. It's Andrew. I know this is unexpected. I just wanted to say I've been thinking about that night, about how we handled it. I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted to say, I see it differently now. I hope you're okay." That was it. No request to reconnect. No invitation. Just a shift. A small, quiet shift. I didn't call back, but I saved the message. Not for sentiment, for evidence. That change is possible. That clarity finds people, eventually. Whether you're waiting for it or not, that same week. Alina, the intern I'd been mentoring, gave a presentation at a regional conference. She opened with a quote. Mine, one I had forgotten I even said. "We rise, not when others welcome us back. We rise when we stop, asking for the key and build our own door." She didn't credit me publicly. She didn't need to. She found it in her own way. And that, more than anything, made me proud, because real influence doesn't look like followers or nameplates or stage lights. It looks like planting something honest and watching it grow without needing to trace the roots back to you. One evening, I pulled out the drawer where I kept the old letters, the acknowledgement, the apology from Vanessa, the letter from my father. I read through them one last time, and then I let them go, not in rage, not in closure, in release. I shredded them, watched the words turn into threads of paper, unrecognizable, not because they meant nothing, but because they no longer defined anything. that night. I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one, and thought about that sentence again, the one that started it all at Thanksgiving dinner. My sister stood up and announced, "We voted, and you're not family anymore." The words used to sting. Now, they felt like something distant, like a story I once heard about someone I used to know. And maybe that's the truest healing of all, not when you erase the pain, but when the memory loses its hold, when you can hear the sentence and not flinch, just breathe. And ask yourself, so what do I build now?